It is time now to move on to our keynote address from Scott Miller. Scott has travelled all the way from Minnesota, USA. I checked the temperature range there, Scott, 7 to 17 today. But Scott's had time to acclimatise to beautiful Australia. He's been in Melbourne and Geelong, and I think he's fair to say you're enjoying beautiful Queensland weather. Scott has worked for the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Minnesota since 2000, and he coordinates Duluth's coordinated community response to DV. He's both a system advocate and coordinator of the Men's Non-Violence Program, and Scott's also instrumental in the evolving work being done in Duluth with that model, which of course is renowned around the world. To give you Scott's full bio, we would be here all day. You'll find it on the Platform 1225 page of the Coalition website, or Google him. But don't confuse him with an Australian Olympic swimmer who got into a bit of strife. Scott's presentation today will offer insight into the needs of women, children and young people who experience DV, and he's going to share his insights into the behaviours of perpetrators of violence as well. He believes if we can all understand the dynamics of abuse in familial context, then we can build better strategies to deal with it. Would you please give a very warm welcome to Scott Miller.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'd like to start by thanking you, sir, for your words and your gift of safety, because there's few gifts that are greater. Thank you. It's great to be here. Like I said, I've been here for 2 weeks, and this is my 3rd year in a row, so I must be doing something well. Just keep getting invited back to the party. My work is really on trying to figure out how to organize all of our systems to work in a coordinated way towards an end goal which increases safety for victims, which is women and children typically, makes it easier to hold offenders accountable, and makes it the work experience of the practitioner better. And if you can do all 3 of those things, you probably have a pretty sustainable response. If you don't do one of those things, then things begin to fall apart. So I have a clicker here. The Duluth model, as you mentioned, was an organizing method that was developed in Duluth early in the women's movement against violence against women in the United States. And what it did is, most movement at the time, there was a lot of building of homes, shelters for women to go to, safe houses. And Ellen Pence, who was my mentor and the one who started this agency, she started talking to women in these homes and asking them, you know, who do you call for help, right? What do you go to? And she started finding out there was really no place to call. And if she called, they didn't know how to respond to her. They didn't know how to take up her problem. They weren't organized to deal with the complexities that she was experiencing. So Ellen developed this method of organizing which starts with the people that we serve. So every intervention that we have, our men's curriculum that we work with men who what we call battered, it's our word for it, the perpetrator here. For women who needed to do exchanges with violent men, we created the first visitation center, contact center, I think is what you call them, in the United States, specifically designed around domestic violence. And it's not because our organizers were, were so smart and insightful. It's because women kept coming to us and saying, you know, there's this whole thing where he's been arrested and now we've got away from him, but we have kids together and the court's ordered us to exchange him, and I'm going to McDonald's parking lot to exchange, and I'm getting berated, I'm getting sexually assaulted, I'm getting beat, and some women are getting killed on those off-site exchanges. We need a safe place to go in order to exchange our children, right? So then we took those words and we created that visitation center, and we talked to the kids about how to design it. And one of the things that I've learned from those kids, working with them about continuing to evolve the work around visitation centers, is it's so, what's good about it for you? It's good that I can go to this center and visit my dad, and he can't be on his phone. He can't be talking to his friends. He can't be watching TV. He has to focus on me. He has to be my dad. And it's good to see my dad in a space where I don't have to worry that my mom is worried what's going to happen to me. Right? I mean, these are the kind of the things that kids really named about the value of being in that particular space, and how we needed to account for those needs as staff. So a woman calls for help, and in most communities, she calls into a huge system that she isn't aware of and doesn't intend for, right? And all these systems have different policies and protocols and missions, and they tend to operate in silos. This is what we do, and when we finish our work and somebody else takes it up, well, then they just have to take it up the way we give it to them, right? What we've learned from women is that all these different processes have institutional timelines that she has to meet, and they all want something from her. And what we've heard over and over from women is that everybody wants something from me after I call for help. But when I call and I want something, there's not a lot of answers. So what our model, what the work I've done for the past 18 years is first going into systems like this and seeing how it operates, see how it runs, see the matrix, right? See beyond the individuals doing the work and see what's behind, what's pushing them to do the work in the particular way that they're doing it. And then find a way to organize and institutionalize changes in the agency that are based on the lived experience of the people that they're serving. One of the things that we've learned is that systems move in a direction where they first take care of themselves. They develop policies and procedures which care for them, right? What we're doing is going in and saying to the people, when the system intervenes in your life, what works? Because we don't want to lose that. And when the system intervenes in your life and does something, what doesn't work for you? Right? And then that becomes our agenda for change going back to these systems. And then we sit down with them and start developing policy and protocols and administrative tools that help push workers in that direction. It's fascinating to me. So advocates, domestic violence advocates, any in the room? Yeah, a few of us, right? Yeah. So we have this thing sometimes where we, separate the world into those who get it and those who don't. It's kind of what we do. And we want to maybe judge a child protection worker because of the decisions they're making. And what we understand is that you can take that advocate who has the freedom to do advocacy in a much different way, and you can stick that same advocate with everything that they know in the role of a child protection worker, and they'll do the same thing. Because that's the system they're in. If we don't change the system, we can't change the outcome, right? Training people to know something doesn't change outcome. I'll give you another example. You have football. Your football, not my football, your football. And I was quite corrected in Geelong that it is not rugby, it's football. I made that mistake. And you have cricket, two very different games, right? So let's say you take all those football players and you bring them over to a cricket field. You show them the tools, you show them the rules, the regulations, you show them how to play. They love the game. They're playing the game. And then you say, now you got to go back to the football field, which is a different field, with different rules, different tools. What are they going to play? They're going to play football. Doesn't matter how much they like cricket, right? They don't have the infrastructure to play the game. That's exactly how we think about systems, right? If we want people, we don't get hung up on individuals making individual decisions and saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person did that. We were invited as an agency to a neighboring state, Wisconsin. By the way, I just got to say, it's a thing to be in a country whose winter is warmer than our summer. But anyway, it's the thing. But we were invited to our neighboring state, Wisconsin, to a community, Superior, to help coordinate their CCR. And they've been meeting for 24 years, and the invitation was basically, we have been meeting for 2 decades, and we're still complaining about the same things. We all meet, we all like each other, we all talk, we all exchange information, but nothing changes. And it's interesting to me, here, I thought that your word integrated was very similar to our word coordinated, right? They're just kind of different words for the same thing. But what I found is that integrated really isn't what we're talking about here. So I was actually in here, Brisbane, and talking to some government people last year, and your law about information sharing had just passed, and the people in one government agency said, we now have a list of things that we can share, and we are sending them to all the people who can get them. And when I talked to the people who are getting the information, they said, oh my gosh, we're just getting buried in information. Like, we're just getting tons of things that half of it we don't need, or we can't read it because it's too much, and it's this frustration, right? If it was coordinated, before that information exchange would have ever happened, what we would have done is we would have went to that agency and said, so what legally can you share? What's the information you're going to share? And get that list from them. Then we would go to each entity that's going to receive that information and say, what information do you need of this? How do you need it formatted so that it's actually useful for the job you're being asked to do? And when do you need it? And then we would go back to that government agency and work with them on producing that information through the lens of the people who need it, right? Now you're actually coordinated. And that takes a lot more work. But the results are substantially different. So from my experience, I can tell you that when I go into a community that is not coordinated, when I go back to a system like this and start looking at all the players and what they're doing in each individual system, they are working much harder than it would be if it was coordinated. This is not efficient. This is not efficient. There's so much duplication of work. It alienates victims from the process. So some systems will get her early on and get what they need, but then she gets so tired of all of what's asked of her that she gives up and she becomes uncooperative, right? That's the designation from the system to her. That's not her experience, right? Her experience is she's just tired of it, right? Because she's not getting anything from it. So how do you coordinate these systems in a way that'll benefit her and the kids? Now, where we start in Wisconsin is we have to have a shared understanding of the problem. The power of how we think about the problem will dictate the rules, the regulations, and the interventions that we do. If we don't all think this, if all these folks here don't think the same way about the problem, if the cops think that this is about relationship problems, you know, they're just fighting again, this is two, they're always in a fight, it's her and him, that kind of thing, right? If they think about it that way, and the advocacy program sees it, no, this is about his violence, this is about him choosing to be violent. And family court, they think it's about his chemical dependency. If you just sober up, then none of this would all happen again. And then you sit all three of those entities in the same room and trying to organize a response. They're going to think that everybody else doesn't get it, but what they don't understand is that the problem is how they think about the problem, right? So as a coordinated response, we're going to share in how we think about the cause of this, and then we come up with a solution. So these are four very typical theories that or ideas, notions about the cause of domestic violence. And normally we would do this as an exercise. I'd break into, but the room's too big, so I'm just going to kind of walk you through it. They lead to very, very different outcomes. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate it as we go. So individual pathology. That means that you can diagnose something in the offender. It individuates the problem to him. So he's an alcoholic. He had child trauma, right? Those kinds of things. He's the problem, not the social conditions that created him. Right? So, individual psychiatric care, treatment for addiction, or therapy. Those would be the things that would be directed with this particular kind of problem. Relationship dysfunction. The belief behind that is it takes two people to tango. In other words, this individual's baggage and this individual's baggage, when they come together, they produce violence. It's produced because of the two individuals. Either can stop the violence of playing off each other, both parties are responsible. And we see this so much in family court, and we also see it in some child protection plans in the United States that I have reviewed. Let me give you an example of one plan, safety plan in a child protection matter. If the husband in the house is irritable that day, the mother is to take all the young children out of the house with her, not leave them there. Couples counseling is for people who have a goal that the relationship is more important than our individual struggles, and we want to find a way through. I've worked with almost 1,000 men who batter over the years. And I can tell you that one thing that they want more than anything is their way. They love their children. Yes, they do. But they love getting their way more. And until that shifts, this kind of thing is not going to work. Right? The cycle of violence. This is a very popular theory. The first book I ever read on domestic violence was in college, 1984. Cycle of violence. The tension building phase, the explosion of violence, and then the honeymoon. And our agency organizers early in the day were teaching this to women. And Ellen Pence has this story about trying to get women to understand this is what was happening to them. And the women kept saying, yeah, this whole honeymoon thing is really not talking to me about, that's not my experience. And she said, well, you just need to look a little closer at your lives and you'll find yourself in this cycle. And they kept pushing back, and finally they said, you know what, we're going to get rid of this thing. And you just tell us what it's like to live with a man who's beating you. What are all the things that he does to get his way? Which became our power and control wheel, which I'll talk about in a minute. She did say that men are socialized to be violent, and that was one of the first times in the literature that appeared that helped us understand that this is a socialization process that we need to pay attention to. The violence does not increase in frequency and severity in most cases of domestic violence. When it does, it's a risk factor for homicide. So that's in the minority of cases. And then anger management is the response, because your emotions are what's driving the violence within this theory. So you learn to manage your anger. Right? And I think we know by now the limitations of anger management with this particular population, because it really isn't driven by anger. I'll give you an example. An advocate gave me this story that I can tell about her life. She said, we were poor, we were living in a home, and I noticed that my daughter, which was not his daughter, that my husband was disciplining her more severely than the daughter that was biologically his. And so I wanted to talk to him about this. So I spent a week putting together the house, making sure everything was the way it was supposed to be, making sure I had the right food in the house, cooked the right meal. I spent an entire week so that I could sit down safely with him and have a conversation about this. He came home, the kids were in bed, and I sat down and I said to him, she said, I just want you to think about how you treat this daughter versus this daughter. I think they notice that it's not the same, and I want you to think about it. She said he put the fork down, he got up out of his chair and left the kitchen. He went into his daughter's bedroom, his biological daughter's bedroom, grabbed her by the ankle, dragged her out of her bed. Now she's sleeping. Now she's not. She's obviously hysterical because she doesn't know what's happening. He drags her through the house into the kitchen, and he hauls back and kicks at her. And she asks him, "Why are you doing this to me, Daddy?" And he said, "Because your mother told me to. Now go to bed." And she runs into the bedroom, hysterical. He sits back down, he picks up his fork, calmly says to her, "Is there anything else that you'd like to talk to me about? What's the message? You do not ever challenge me." So dominant. This is what we settled on, not because, again, that we were the ones who thought of it. It was because the women told us, this is what it's like living with this particular kind of man in the home. And not only is it the physical and the sexual violence or the threat of those things and all these other tactics, but it's reinforced by the culture. That his entitlement isn't just in the home, it's where I go. It's when I go to church. It's reinforced there that he gets to decide. Right? I was talking to a woman who was a new men's group facilitator and mentoring her into that process. And I said, so next week we're going to talk about male privilege. So what I want you to do as facilitators is think about how, as women, you've intersected with male privilege. 2 days go by, they call me up and they said, on a conference call thing, and he said, "Scott, we don't know where to start with this one. Why? It just seems like it's so big that I don't even know where to start thinking about it." Right? And I said, "So why don't you, how have it intersected in your individual personal life?" And one of the women said, maybe it happens because my husband never gets up with the kid. Never has. I'm the only one who does. And I said, well, does he think that because you're the woman that this is your role and that he gets to sleep in? She said, I don't think it's it. I don't think it's entitlement. I said, what do you think it is? She said, honestly, I just think he doesn't know how to be in a relationship. I think he's just dumb about it. Right? He doesn't know how to do this. Okay, I said, let's just go with that. Let's just go with the idea that he's clueless about how to be in a relationship and be a partner in a family. If you didn't get up with your kids, who would be talking to you? Oh my gosh. My mom, his mom, the teachers, like my relative, like everybody would be talking to me. I said, who's ever talked to him? She said, me. Right. The expectation is culturally is where, and where isn't it? So regardless of whether he's tied in mentally to his entitlement or not, he's absolutely benefiting from it. And as a man, I can tell you, and we talk to this about men in group all the time, how are you going to stay straight? Because you are going to be invited every day to be a different kind of man than the one you're talking about in this room. That's how many invitations are out there. To think that somehow our words are more important, that our thinking is correct, right, when it comes to men and women. So one of the things we learned is that we need to balance this power differential by using the power of the state. That's what women talked about. We are people here. We are in danger, and the state isn't protecting us. How do we organize the state to come in and protect us so that the responsibility isn't on us? Right? So this power and control wheel was developed with the Duluth model. We sat down with women. We asked them what their experience was. They told us. We worked with them in partnership to develop a graphic that explained what it was like to live in that home, a graphic representation. And what they wanted was physical and sexual violence around the outside. They said that's what holds all those tactics together. Without that, the tactics on the inside don't mean much. But with that threat or that actual use of that kind of violence, it changes how these things play out in our lives. So you can think, you might have been emotionally abusive to a partner that you've had in your life, right? So how is it different in this system versus your life, right? Let's say you get in an argument with your partner and you decide, I'm done. I'm going to walk out. I'm just leaving. Okay, so you leave. Everybody's probably happy for the moment. Like, you don't have to talk to you. I don't have to, right? And we can come back and we'll work this out later on. What's it like in here? He blows out the door, and now she has to start considering. When's he coming back? How's he coming back? Will he be sober? Should I get the kids and load them up now at 2 in the morning, go to my mom's and not come back until I know it's safe? Right? That's what she has to consider now. That's how this ends up looking different, right? And what the women said is that he ends up with this power over me. Right? The men didn't say that. When we work with men in group, it's things like, you know what, when I come home from work, I just want her to shut the fuck up. Okay? How he gets her to do that is this. And how he gets her to do it gives him that power over her. So when we have this as our way of thinking, which is, again, not an idea or a theory about domestic violence, but what women actually said, what their lives were like, when we have that as a coordinated response, and we start looking through that lens, now we have a way of coordinating policy and protocol and tools together among agencies to come to a coordinated response, regardless if it's the housing agencies, the medical sector, criminal justice, child protection, whatever it is. Any system can be organized that way. And we've been doing it for 38 years. So it takes time. We're not done, okay? So this, right? It takes a long time. So one of the things we also have is that there's 3 kinds of violence, right? There's the battering or coercive control violence. There's resistive violence that comes out of this. So if I'm living with this, there are all kinds of ways I'm going to resist it. But that's the notion. You are what I want you to be. Right? And the only one who gets to decide it is the one at the top. So here's the thing. When you follow one of these offenders through any system, as they engage that system, and if you map out what they're talking about, over and over and over and over again, what they want to talk about is her. They want to tell you all the reasons why they're a victim of her poor behavior. Right? If we don't have a lens as a community to understand what resistance looks like, then we collude with him. And it makes it easier for him to abuse. Not easier to hold him accountable, but actually easier for him to be abusive. And what is she thinking about? So in systems, we want to assess this guy. We want to assess his risk. So we have tools that assess his reoffense, his likelihood to reoffend or his likelihood to commit a murder. What's she thinking about? The other stuff. She's been managing this for a long time. And then the system comes to her and says, look at how dangerous he is. Yeah, well, where's my insurance? Where's my transportation? Where's my housing? Where's my food? Where's all that going to come from? Because that's what women end up talking about the most, is the risk. Where am I going to get those needs met? Right? And that's a lot of you in here, right? That can supply those immediate needs. Institutional responses. If I call and ask for help, what's it going to mean? Am I going to lose my kids? Right? Am I going to have to leave my house? Like in Duluth, we've got situations where the woman gets beaten by this man in her home, and child protection comes and takes her out of the home basically by force. Either you leave with your kids or I'm taking the kids. So now she has to leave her home and live with her mother while he continues to reside in the home she's paying for. Right? That's a risk that she has to think about. And the more of those kind of experiences that she has, the more alienated she's going to become from the system. The more alienated she becomes from the system, the easier it is for him to abuse. It's fascinating to me how system folks can get really judgmental and frustrated with victims and what victims do. Right? Go back to this system. Inside this system here, if you're standing on the outside and you're looking at the decisions people are making, you're thinking, that's some dysfunctional behavior. But I can tell you, inside that system, it's functional because it's what keeps you safe. It may be counterintuitive to you, but it's not counterintuitive inside, right? So, So when we're thinking about risk in her, and I want to say that on Rosie's organization on the Gold Coast, what's the name of it? Sorry. DVPC, has just taken me through a fantastic way that they're assessing for risk. The first time I've ever been able to see it done, where they're not only assessing his risk, but they're incorporating all of her, what she's identifying as her risks, into the overall assessment. That is a beautiful thing. And do it in a way where they can protect what she's telling them. Right? So that is a goal. Aspects of culture. We worked with evangelical women living in an evangelical community in Duluth. And one of the things we learned from them is that they don't call the police. They're not going to bring the secular community into their home. Their 911 is the pastor. So they said, if you want to organize in our community, you have to organize with the pastor because they're going to control everything. And they had all of the same burdens that a battered woman has anywhere else. And on top of that, their faith was being used against them. And so the church would say to this one particular woman, you can separate from him. Well, he goes to the men's program. Well, he went and then he quit. And she realized that if I go back to him, the life I had is the life I'm going to have. Nothing's going to change. So she filed for divorce. And the church said, you no longer are welcome to worship here. Invited him back in, right? And then she tells us, not only did I lose my family, I lost my faith family. So that's an example of how culture also can be one of the risks that she has to think about. And we have to incorporate that because women who are battered, kids who are beaten, don't experience just the violence. They also experience the poverty. They also experience racism. Right? They experience all kinds of things simultaneously. And if our responses don't have a way of taking up the totality of who they are, then it's going to feel like, when you're on this end, it's going to feel like you just don't understand what's going on. You don't understand what's happening to you. And then you're not a resource. So the Duluth model approach is the way to organize. What we organize is all these different agencies, both community and system, government, to come together in a way that works in unison towards an ultimate goal. Safer, more accountable, and better for the practitioner. I won't go through these principles, but every policy we create aligns with these principles. In every agency in Duluth that is part of our CCR, from 911 to the men's program in the community, all have policies and protocols that align with these principles. That's how we keep things tight. We all have a shared understanding about the problem. There are 3 types of domestic violence that we have to account for. Those who are using violence to have power over somebody, violence that comes out of resisting that, and everything else that happens as a domestic in a home. The power of the state should be restricted to controlling the illegal activity of the offender. Because a mother and her children are being beaten, we don't dictate what happens to them. We dictate what happens to the person causing the violence. That is a huge shift for some government agencies. In a coordinated committee response, one of the goals is to shift the responsibility for holding him accountable from the victim to the state. Right? Because you have the resources. Right? You have leverage. She doesn't. And then the leverage that you use has to be meaningful to him. The numbers of breaches that happen here. And again, from Victoria to New South Wales to Queensland. I mean, it's not, when I look at that kind of recidivism, I'm thinking that consequence is not meaningful to him. Maybe I'm understating it. But you have to find something that's meaningful to him. There are indigenous people that I've worked with in Canada. What means something to him is not losing his community. And when the community comes to him and says, if you continue to do this and you don't fix what's going on, you won't get to live here. That's meaningful to him. That's not criminal justice, but that's meaningful to him, right? In England, when I was over there, the right to housing, I love that. We don't have that in the United States. By any stretch of the imagination. I see more homeless people in my community of Duluth, Minnesota, walking a half a mile to the courthouse than I've seen in 3 large cities in Australia. Our homelessness is hard to wrap your head around. So we don't have that right. Victims are rarely free to cooperate with the system and hold offenders accountable. Just think how different it would be for victims if everybody believed that in their heart. How much would change? Account for the power differences between victim and offender. One of the most profound things I learned from a victim in a focus group was, she said, whatever you do, you can't lose sight of the power he has over me. Why? Because every step I take, I'm accounting for it. And if you aren't accounting for it, then you'll lose sight of me. Because it's what I have to do every single day. So, our law enforcement, when they go to the scene, by policy, cannot interview a victim of domestic assault in the presence of an offender. By policy, they have to separate. And the men's program, how does it all the way to the other end, right? We don't do skill building with men who batter. We don't teach them skills because they don't have skill deficit. They have thinking. It gives them entitlement. That's what we work on, right? So what the women said is that when you send him home to me with this assignment to work out a plan for the money, this is a real case. The guy goes home, sits down with her. So, yeah, we're supposed to work out a plan with the money. She grabbed the checkbook. She said, fuck you, threw it in his face and left. He comes back into the men's program. I'm doing the work. It's just that she could really use a group. She's pretty angry. Yeah. We didn't, what the women helped us see as a program, who are you sending him home to for this assignment, right? A woman he's beating, has humiliated, sexually violated, right? Possibly taken her kids from her. And now he's going to sit down and have a money conversation based in equity? It's not going to happen, right? So stop sending him home with the skill stuff, right? So we did. We listened. And then batters are responsible for their violence, period. If you are beating somebody to dominate them, it's on you. There's no excuse. There's nothing other than the fact that you're choosing to be violent. And you need to understand, and one of the things Ellen said too that really helped me as a facilitator is that when we work with the men, this violence is historical, right? That when he slaps her across the face, there is a legacy that he is executing as a man that has been passed down to him. And there's a lot of ways that gets passed down. And to understand their own personal connection to that violence and how they learned that. Because when you learn what your history is, you can engage in it. You can move from it. Otherwise, it's just this invisible thing that just keeps pushing you in a direction that you have a hard time changing. So the coordinated community response that we talk about isn't just putting agencies together in a nice puzzle piece. It's actually to change the climate of tolerance in the community so that there's a different narrative in the community when you start doing this. So what do we hear? Guys come into our men's program and they'll say, you know what, when I lived in Illinois, slap your wife, nobody really gives a damn. But here in Minnesota, what they call it, all of a sudden something's all different, right? Now I got probation officers coming to my house. Are you kidding me? Right? Making sure that I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. And we do that, we change that climate of tolerance by institutionalizing practices and procedures, centralizing victim safety. And institutionalizing means through policy and protocol. There isn't a single Duluth cop, including the chief, who's ever worked, as of 6 years ago when the last officer retired, who's ever worked outside of the policy that we sat down and partnered and developed with the police department. This is just what they do. And every successive chief just inherits that institutionalized practice that we have around domestic assault. Basically, what we do in a CCR is we discover the problems by talking to the victims. We organize with agencies to solve them, and then we track to see if it works. Fundamentally, that's it. That's years of work, but I want to say fundamentally, that's it. If you sit, can you tell me how much? I get 10? Oh, 10 now? Yeah, okay, good. If you, I'll give you an example in Western state, in the United States. The judges had a problem. The judges had a problem because the CCR had just organized mandatory arrest. So now all these men are getting arrested and women are getting arrested because they didn't have a self-defense predominant aggressor policy to account for it. So men and women are coming through the system. And the judge's problem was docket. The dockets are jam full. We got to clear the dockets. So the judges came up with, on their own, without the advocates, without victims, without talking to anybody, they came up with a deferral plan. So after your first appearance, you plead not guilty, right? Because that's what virtually all male offenders do. They plead not guilty at a first appearance. Then the second appearance, if it's your first offense, you're offered a deferral. What they didn't understand is that when women are arrested, they, in a high percentage of cases, plead guilty at their first appearance because they have to get home, because they have kids there, and they can't trust him to take care of them. They have all kinds of reasons, and they think about their violence differently. Right? Their violence, for the most part, is resistive. They're not ashamed of it. I did this because he's been doing this to me. Right? He has a whole different analysis of why he's using violence. Right? So, in any system, we have to have a way to make those kind of determinations and figure out what's what. If we don't, we marginalize the women. And in that community, most of the women end up being convicted of domestic assault, and most of the men were getting deferrals. Not the goal, but that's what happens when the system organizes to benefit itself. I got a docket problem that needs to be fixed. This is our, so there's all kinds of controversy about whether recidivism is a good measure of change. But for our CCR, it's a valuable number, because what's the most valuable thing that people in the government don't have enough of? Time, right? They just don't have enough time in these cases because they take a lot of time if you want to do them well. So they want to know, is the extra time that we're investing in all of our responses getting us the results? So in 98 to 99, we took 353 guys. 29% of those men ended up back into the system 8 years from their last point of contact with the system. In 04 to 05, we had 326, 34% overall recidivism, and this time we broke it out by men who completed. Ended up back in the system who completed the class. 41% did not complete the class. So one of the things it taught us was we need to change what we're doing in the criminal system to really create more incentive for these men to get through the men's program, because we can get another 11% bump off of that if we could achieve that. But then the system is thinking, okay, so if overall you're taking 7 out of 10 of these guys off the table, right? You're helping reduce the caseload for probation, for the courts, for law enforcement, right? Well, what's law enforcement's huge complaint? I don't want to go back to the same house over and over and over and over again, right? We're impacting that, right? That provides incentive for the system to say we want to continue to evolve in the CCR. So, I have been really, in fact, I was here with a number of trainers from Duluth. We had a judge, prosecutor, advocate, law enforcement, probation, a team of people who were at 2 conferences in Victoria and in Cleveland. And our collective response was that we felt like we learned more than we probably gave. Because the inspiration that we garnered from the people that we have met, the commitment, the resources, the commitment of government to put money forward. Money that we probably work with 20% of the financial support that you have in the United States. There's just no money in the United States for this kind of work. It's just stunning. And so I sat down at breakfast this morning, and I just wrote two thoughts that came out of both a conversation we had last night about being in this work and ultimately why we do what we do. When we get together and we have those conversations, we've never, at least in my experience, we've never talked about services. We don't talk about services. We talk about the people in those services. My invitation to you is not to get up every morning to execute a service or a job. It's to get up every day and be the person that people like me will talk about for the rest of their lives. So thank you for the work you do, and thank you for your time.